Case 1. Rosemarie Essa. Before she left the house that afternoon, her husband handed her a calcium pill. She took it. She never made it to the movie. Everyone called her Rosie. Rosemarie Essa was a nurse, the kind her co-workers remembered as gentle, the kind who was drawn to people who needed help. She was 38, a mother of a young son and a young daughter, and by every account she was devoted to them. She and her husband were said to be planning for a third child. It looked like the life she'd always wanted. On an afternoon in February 2005, Rosie set out to catch a movie with her sister. Somewhere on the drive, she began to feel sick. Her car slowed to a crawl, enough that people nearby noticed and called for help, before she drifted into a passing vehicle. The crash was minor, the kind people walk away from every day. Rosie didn't. She was rushed to the hospital, and she died there. And what killed her wasn't on that road at all. Because while she was still driving, still able to, she made a phone call. She called a friend named Eva. She said she wasn't feeling well, and then she said the sentence that would crack this case open, that her husband had given her a calcium pill before she left, and she wondered if it was the reason. She had no idea she was leaving evidence behind. She was just talking to someone she trusted. At first, nothing looked like a crime. A healthy young woman had collapsed behind the wheel and died after a minor accident. It didn't add up, but it didn't point anywhere. Then Eva made a call of her own, to Rosie's brother, and refused to let it go. "Promise me you'll get a full autopsy. Promise me a toxicology report." She kept insisting. That insistence is the only reason there's a case at all. When the coroner ran a fuller analysis, they found cyanide in her system and in traces from inside her car. Cyanide doesn't turn up by accident, and a routine test doesn't look for it. Hold on to that, because it's the heart of this story. If no one had pushed, no one would ever have known to look. Now investigators had a poisoning, and a wife's own words, saying her husband made sure she took a pill before she left. That husband, Yazid Essa, was an emergency room doctor. A man whose whole profession was knowing what goes into the human body, in what dose, to what effect. A man with the training to understand exactly what a capsule can be made to hold. Police questioned him, and then he did what an innocent man almost never does. He left. Not the county. The country. For 19 months, he moved through the Middle East, staying ahead of everyone looking for him. He was arrested in Cyprus in 2006 on a false passport, fought extradition for 2 more years, and wasn't returned to Cleveland until 2009, nearly 4 years after Rosie died. The trial was harder than it should have been. There was almost no physical evidence tying his hands to the crime, so prosecutors built it from the people who knew him, colleagues, friends, women he'd been involved with. They called the killing what it was, a substitute for a divorce. Then his own brother took the stand and told the jury what Essa had admitted. It was enough. In March 2010, a jury convicted Yazid Essa of aggravated murder. Life in prison, no parole for 20 years, upheld on appeal. Here's what this case leaves us with, and to be clear, this is our own observation, not a legal finding. It isn't really about poison. It's about a test that almost never happened. Rosie's death was first written down as a car accident, a healthy 38-year-old, gone in an afternoon, and the record nearly ended there. Cyanide isn't on a standard screen. If one friend hadn't refused to let go, the truth might have stayed buried in a traffic file. So here's the part we'd want you to carry with you. When a healthy adult dies suddenly, and something just doesn't sit right, it's okay to ask questions. Families and next of kin can request a full toxicological workup. They can ask that specimens be held rather than released. Time and again, the poisoning cases that get answered are answered for one reason. Someone insisted on the test nobody thought to order. That's not a legal rule. It's just what this story, and so many like it, seem to teach. Rosie did her part. Feeling the poison take hold, still behind the wheel, she picked up the phone and named the thing that was wrong. Her friend did her part and refused to stay silent. That's the whole chain. Ordinary people deciding a small, strange detail was worth taking seriously. Rosemarie Essa. Rosie. A nurse who spent her life caring for other people, a mother of two who was dreaming about a third. She deserved to grow old with her children. She deserved so much more than the afternoon she was given. We say her name so it isn't the ending that gets remembered, but the woman who, in her last clear moments, made sure the truth would find its way home. Case 2. Jill Hand. The 911 call said a stranger had broken into the house and shot his wife. By the end, investigators would prove the only stranger in that story was the truth. Her name was Jill. She was 58 years old, and she had married Gerald Hand in 1992, a few months after they met. To the people around them, the Hands were a settled, comfortable couple in Delaware County, just north of Columbus. Gerald owned a radiator shop in the city. Jill was his fourth wife, and by early 2002, the marriage was in trouble, quietly, the way these things often are. Jill wanted a divorce. On the night of January 15, 2002, Gerald Hand called the police with a terrible story. An intruder had forced his way into their home, he said, and shot Jill. He'd grabbed 2 revolvers of his own and fired back, killing the man, a man he claimed he didn't recognize. But he did recognize him. The intruder was Walter Lonnie Welch, Hand's longtime friend and sometime employee at the radiator shop. His body was found in a neighbor's driveway, and almost immediately, the self-defense story began to come apart. Because when investigators looked closer, they didn't find a random home invasion. They found a motive on paper. Gerald Hand was carrying heavy debt, and there was a life insurance policy on Jill. Prosecutors laid out what they believed had really happened that night. That Hand had arranged for Welch to kill Jill for the insurance money and then killed Welch himself, to silence the one man who could describe the arrangement. The physical evidence backed them. Blood spatter and DNA on Hand's own clothing contradicted his account of where he'd been standing when the shots were fired. And a former cellmate testified that Hand had told him, plainly, that he'd hired a man and that the deal had gone bad. There was one more layer to this case, and it's a heavy one, so I want to be precise about it. At trial, prosecutors also presented evidence about 2 of Hand's earlier wives. His first wife, Donna, was found strangled in 1976. His second wife, Lori, was found dead a few years later, in similar circumstances. He collected insurance after each death. Now, and this matters, Gerald Hand was never charged in either of those deaths. Both cases officially remain unsolved. That evidence was introduced at his trial as part of the state's argument, and that is the only frame we're placing it in here. For the murders of Jill Hand and Walter Welch, though, a Delaware County jury reached a verdict. In June 2003, they convicted Gerald Hand of 2 counts of aggravated murder. It was the first capital murder conviction in the county's history. He was sentenced to death. He exhausted his appeals in 2018, and he remains on Ohio's death row today, under a reprieve issued by the governor as the state works through a pause in executions. Here's what this case leaves us with, and again, this is our own observation, not a legal finding. The thing that undid Gerald Hand wasn't a witness, and it wasn't a confession. It was paper. Debt he couldn't explain. An insurance policy with a name and a number and a date on it. In our experience looking at these cases, the story a person tells and the paperwork they leave behind don't always match, and the paperwork doesn't know how to lie. So here's the part worth carrying. A life insurance policy taken out or changed right before a death, a shift in who benefits, mounting debt beside a pending divorce. These aren't private feelings. They're documents. They're dated, they're filed, and they're held by banks, by insurers, by courts. If a family ever suspects something isn't right, those records can be asked about. Investigators who follow the paper often find the motive long before they find the weapon. That's not a rule of law. It's just what these stories seem to keep teaching us. Jill Hand, a woman who, at 58, had simply decided she wanted a different life and had every right to have one. She wanted out, and she deserved the chance to walk into whatever came next. She didn't get it. We say her name so that the last word on Jill isn't a false 911 call about a stranger in the dark, but a woman the record shows was ready to choose herself and should have been allowed to. Case 3. Kristan Strutz. He told everyone she'd gone to the store. Her purse was in his car. Her phone was on the counter. And it would be almost the end of the day before he called anyone at all. That delay is the entire case. Her name was Kristan. She was 28 years old, a mother of 4, and a nursing assistant who had cared for people at a Cincinnati rehabilitation center for years. She lived in Delhi Township, just west of the city. To the people who knew her, she was a young mom in the thick of raising a family, a full house, 4 children who needed her, an ordinary life on an ordinary street. On the morning of August 15, 2009, that life stopped, and the story her husband told about it never once held together. John Strutz said Kristan had left to go to the store that morning. But the things a person takes when they leave the house, Kristan hadn't taken them. Her purse was in his car. Her phone was still in the house. Her own car was sitting in the driveway, the door open, the key still in it. Nothing about that morning looked like a woman who had driven off to run an errand. And she had somewhere to be. That weekend, she was supposed to be getting ready for a cousin's wedding. And here is the part that matters most, what he did with the hours after. He didn't call the police. Not that morning, not that afternoon. Instead, he moved through an ordinary day. He stopped at a discount store and bought bleach and a mop. He stopped at a grocery store and bought garbage bags. It was not until late that afternoon that he finally reported his wife missing, and even then, it wasn't really his idea. Kristan's family had been trying to reach her. Her mother, Karen, spoke to John that afternoon, and it was Karen who told him he needed to call the police to help find her. The county prosecutor would later put it plainly. It was almost as if the family had to guilt him into making the call. That pressure, from Kristan's own mother, is what finally put the report on the record. Once investigators started looking, the pieces came together fast. The garbage bags he'd bought that morning were traced, and they matched. Kristan's remains were recovered at the family's own Delhi Township home. Detectives also learned that John had told a woman he'd been seeing that he wasn't married at all, and had told others that he and Kristan were splitting up. When it came to trial, John Strutz waived his right to a jury. He put his fate in the hands of a single judge. And in April 2010, that judge said he was convinced beyond all reasonable doubt and convicted John Strutz of murder, tampering with evidence, and gross abuse of a corpse. He was sentenced to 26 years to life. The coroner was never able to determine exactly how Kristan died, but the court had no doubt about who was responsible. Here's what this case leaves us with, and as always, this is our own observation, not a legal finding. Look at the shape of that first day. When someone genuinely believes their partner is missing, the timeline usually looks one way. Immediate calls, immediate panic, the police brought in right away. What we see again and again in cases that end in a conviction is the opposite. Errands, ordinary activity, a report that comes late, and a story that has to be explained instead of simply told. So here's the part worth holding on to. If someone in your life goes quiet, and the person closest to them seems strangely calm, running errands, offering shifting explanations, in no hurry to involve anyone, you don't have to wait, and you don't have to be next of kin. You can call the police yourself and ask for a welfare check. It costs nothing. Kristan's family are the reason a report was ever filed at all. Their worry and their refusal to let it go is what forced the question. That's not a rule of law. It's just what these stories keep showing us. Kristan Strutz, 28 years old, a nursing assistant who spent her days caring for others, and a mother of 4. Those 4 children are being raised today by Kristan's parents, who stepped in and never let go. She should have been there for every bit of it, the birthdays, the first days of school, an ordinary, unremarkable, beautiful long life. She deserved so much more than the morning she was given. We say her name, so the last word on Kristan isn't a lie about a trip to the store, but a young mother who was loved, who is missed, and whose children are still surrounded by a family that carries her forward. Case 4. Rhonda Short. Weeks before she died, her husband read her a newspaper story out loud. It was about a man who killed his wife after she left him. Then he told her he'd do the same. She had already left. Her name was Rhonda. She was 31 years old, and she was a mother. Before everything came apart, she'd lived with her husband, Dwayne, in Middletown, Ohio, and she was close with the people at her church, the kind of woman who took her kids out for ice cream after Sunday service with friends from the congregation. When her marriage turned dangerous, Rhonda did the hardest and most important thing a person in her situation can do. She left. She got herself and her children to a new home in Huber Heights, and she started building a life on her own terms. But Dwayne Short had told her what he intended to do, and he'd told her clearly. In the weeks before the murder, he confronted Rhonda holding a newspaper clipping, a story about a husband who had murdered his wife after she walked out. He read it to her, out loud. And then he said that if she ever left him, that's exactly what he would do to her. She had already left. So he went looking for her. This is where the case stops being about rage and starts being about planning. Rhonda had moved, and Dwayne didn't know her new address, so he found it by deception. He called the power company, gave them Rhonda's social security number, and got a customer service representative to confirm a newly opened account in her name, at an address on Pepper Drive. That afternoon, he drove to Huber Heights. He stopped at a real estate office and asked an agent to print him a map to the address. The agent later testified about what struck her most, his demeanor. She described him as calm, normal. Then he armed himself. He bought a shotgun and sawed off the barrel, a detail he admitted himself from the witness stand at his own trial. And he went to Rhonda's house. Rhonda was killed there. So was Donnie Sweeney, a man from her church community who was present at the home. A Montgomery County jury heard all of it. The clipping, the threat, the phone call to the power company, the map, the sawed-off shotgun. In 2006, they convicted Dwayne Short of 2 counts of aggravated murder, and they recommended a sentence of death. The Ohio Supreme Court affirmed that sentence, unanimously, in 2011. Here's what this case leaves us with. And as always, this is our own observation, not a legal finding. Dwayne Short didn't snap. He announced. Weeks in advance, in plain language, he told the exact person he would later kill precisely what he was going to do. And then, step by step, he did the work to make it happen. In the cases we look at, a spoken threat to kill is almost never just heat-of-the-moment venting. It's a statement of intent, and it climbs higher, far higher, the moment it's paired with someone actually going out and acquiring a weapon. So here's the part worth carrying. "I'll kill you if you leave" is not a phrase to absorb quietly and hope passes. It is, on its own, one of the most serious warning signs there is. In most places, a threat like that can support a protection order, and in many, the threat itself is a crime. If someone tells you their partner said this to them, treat the threat as the emergency, not what might come after it. The threat is the moment to act. That's not a rule of law. It's just what these stories, again and again, seem to be trying to teach us. Rhonda Short, 31 years old, A mother who found the courage to leave and to start over, which is the bravest thing a person in danger can do. She did everything right. She got out. She should be here, watching her children grow, living the ordinary life she fought for. We say her name, so the last word on Rhonda isn't the threat a cruel man read to her from a scrap of newspaper, but the woman who refused to stay and deserved every one of the years that were taken from her. Case 5. Sarah Widmer. It took 3 trials, across 3 years, to reach a verdict in this case. And it very nearly didn't happen at all, because of what a few jurors did in their own bathrooms at home. Her name was Sarah. She was 24 years old, a dental hygienist, and she had been married for just 4 months. She and her husband, Ryan, lived in Hamilton Township, in Warren County, north of Cincinnati, a young couple barely into their marriage, with a whole life still ahead of them. On the night of August 11th, 2008, that life ended, and the question of exactly how has been argued about ever since. That night, Ryan Widmer called 911. He told the dispatcher he had found Sarah in the bathtub, unresponsive, that she must have fallen asleep in the water and slipped under. First responders rushed to the home and tried to revive her. She was pronounced dead a short time later. But something at the scene didn't fit the story. When first responders arrived, only Sarah's hair was damp. There were no wet towels, no soaked rags, no water where you'd expect to find it if someone had just been pulled from a full tub. That single observation, noted in the first minutes by the first people through the door, is what turned an apparent tragedy into a homicide investigation. What followed was one of the most unusual court histories in Ohio. Ryan Widmer was tried not once, but 3 times. At the first trial, in 2009, a jury convicted him. But that verdict was thrown out, and the reason is the heart of this entire case. The judge learned that jurors had gone home during the trial and conducted their own private experiments. They'd taken baths themselves and timed how long it took their skin and hair to dry, then brought those results back into the jury room. That is not allowed. A jury is required to decide a case only on the evidence presented in the courtroom, nothing they gather on their own. Because they broke that rule, the conviction could not stand, and Ryan Widmer was granted a new trial. The second trial, in 2010, ended with a hung jury. They couldn't agree. It was only at the third trial, in February 2011, that a jury finally convicted Ryan Widmer of murder. He was sentenced to 15 years to life. Now, we want to be careful and honest about this case because it remains genuinely debated. The jurors who convicted him never settled on a single agreed scenario for exactly how Sarah died, and no clear motive was ever established. Ryan Widmer has maintained his innocence, continuously, from the night of the 911 call to today. His appeals have been rejected at every level, by the state courts and by the federal courts, most recently in 2025. That same year, the parole board denied his release. He won't be eligible again until 2030. Those are the facts of where this case stands. We report the verdict and the history. We don't tell you what to conclude beyond them. Here's what this case leaves us with, and as always, this is our own observation, not a legal finding. There are 2 things worth taking from it. The first is quiet but important. The details first responders write down in the opening minutes. A dry towel, a dry floor, can end up mattering years later because a scene like that exists only once. Nobody can go back and re-observe it. But the second lesson is the one people almost never hear, and it's the one we'd point you to. The reason a conviction in this case was erased, thrown out entirely, is that jurors ran experiments at home. When you serve on a jury and you're told to decide only on what's presented in court, that instruction can feel like a technicality. It isn't. It is the exact mechanism that makes a verdict able to survive. Jurors who go looking for their own evidence, however well-intentioned, can collapse an entire trial and force everyone, the family most of all, to start over from the beginning. If you're ever in that seat, That rule is in your hands. That's not us stating the law. It's just what this case, more than any other, seems built to teach. Sarah Widmer, 24 years old, 4 months married, a young woman who cared for people's health for a living and had every reason to expect a long and ordinary life. Whatever the arguments that still swirl around her case, none of them are about her, about the person she was, or the years she should have had. We say her name so that Sarah isn't remembered as a legal controversy, but as the young woman at the center of it, someone's daughter, someone's friend, gone far too soon, and worth remembering for her life, and not only for how it ended. Case 6. Fatoumata Diallo. He called 911 to report a fire. He told the dispatcher he'd gotten the children out. What he didn't know was that a small camera on his own front door had been quietly recording the truth the whole time. Her name was Fatoumata. She was 32 years old, a mother, and an immigrant from Guinea, in West Africa, who had built a life for her family in Columbus, Ohio. She had returned home from a trip to Guinea just about 2 weeks before she died. That's much of what the public record tells us about her, a young mother, far from where she was born, raising her children in a new country. On September 30th, 2021, that life was taken from her inside her own home. That afternoon, Mamadou Diallo called for help. He told the 911 dispatcher there was a fire in the house. Asked if everyone was out, he said he thought he'd gotten the kids out but couldn't get back inside. When firefighters arrived and pushed through the smoke, they found Fatoumata in the home. The coroner would determine she had been strangled and that the fire had been set afterward, on top of her, using an accelerant. This was not a fire that killed her. It was a fire meant to hide what already had. And here is where the case turned. Diallo's account was that he'd come home and discovered the fire, that he wasn't there when it started. But the Diallo's own home had a video doorbell. And that doorbell doesn't get tired, doesn't get nervous, and doesn't change its story. The footage showed that Mamadou Diallo had arrived home roughly 40 to 50 minutes before the fire ever started. It showed him coming and going, walking to his truck and back, moving around in front of the house, well before he called for help. His timeline and the camera's timeline did not match. Investigators also found a small amount of Fatoumata's blood on a shirt connected to him. The case went to a 6-day trial. On July 19, 2023, a Franklin County jury convicted Mamadou Diallo of murder, aggravated arson, tampering with evidence, and gross abuse of a corpse. At sentencing, the judge, a man with 17 years on the bench, said it was one of the worst cases he had ever seen. Diallo was sentenced to life in prison, eligible for parole only after 27 years. He maintained his innocence and appealed. The Ohio courts affirmed his conviction, first in 2025 and again after a second review, and it stands today. Here's what this case leaves us with, and as always, this is our own observation, not a legal finding. There's a reason this one belongs in a modern list, and it isn't the crime. It's the witness. The thing that dismantled a rehearsed story wasn't a person who could be intimidated or confused on the stand. It was a small camera on a front door, keeping a time-stamped record that no one thought to account for. In case after case now, the quietest witness in the house is the one nobody can talk out of the truth. So here's the part worth carrying, and it cuts both ways, so we'll give you both edges. On one hand, the ordinary technology in and around our homes, doorbell cameras, smart locks, thermostats, the location history in a car, is building a timeline all the time, and that timeline can be the thing that answers for someone who can no longer speak. If a loved one's death is ever questioned, those records exist, and they can be asked for. But the other edge is just as real, and we'd be doing you a disservice not to say it. Those very same devices are also used by controlling and abusive partners to monitor, track, and trap the people they claim to love. The same doorbell that catches a killer can be turned into a leash. Technology isn't the hero or the villain here. People are, That's not a rule of law. It's just what these stories keep showing us, on both sides of the lens. Fatoumata Diallo, 32 years old, a mother who crossed an ocean to build something better for her children, and who had every right to grow old watching them thrive in the country she chose. She came so far, and she was so close. She deserved decades in the home she made, not the ending she was given inside it. We say her name, Fatoumata, so that she is remembered not for the fire that was meant to erase her, but as the woman it could not, a mother, a newcomer who belonged, and someone whose life mattered and still does. Case 7. Diane Stroud. For 6 weeks, no one filed a missing person report. And the reason no one did is the most chilling part of this case, because the man answering everyone's questions used to be the one who filed those reports himself. Her name was Diane. She was 53 years old, and she was a public servant in the truest, most local sense of the phrase. She served 2 full terms on the Mentor on the Lake City Council, from 1996 to 2003, 8 years, including a year as council president. The people she served remembered her simply, a good member of council, a good person, and a good mother who took pride in her family. She had a life with a public face and a private warmth, in a small Ohio community on the shore of Lake Erie, where people knew her name. In October of 2011, Diane stopped being seen. And into that silence, her husband, Gary Stroud, supplied a series of explanations. He told neighbors she had left him. He told family she had gone out of state. He told them she had joined a cult. The stories shifted depending on who was asking, but the message was always the same. Diane was simply gone, and there was nothing to worry about. Here's what makes those explanations land the way they do. Gary Stroud was a retired Mentor police officer and a part-time special deputy for the Lake County Sheriff's Office. This was a man who had spent a career on the other side of exactly this situation, a man who knew, better than almost anyone, how a missing person case gets opened, what triggers it, and what happens when one never does. When he told people not to worry, he was speaking with the built-in authority of a badge. And for 6 weeks it worked. What finally broke it wasn't a detective. It was family. Visiting relatives noticed an odor coming from the garage of the Stroud home on Marine Parkway. One of them was troubled enough by it that she called the police. When officers searched the garage, they found Diane. The county coroner determined she had died of blunt force trauma to the head. She had been struck with a blunt object. She had been in that garage, the coroner estimated, for as long as 6 weeks. Gary Stroud was indicted on 12 counts. In July 2012, he pleaded guilty to murder and gross abuse of a corpse. At his sentencing that August, his own children spoke. His daughter stood and named all the things her parents would now both miss: her wedding, the grandchildren who would never meet them. Stroud, for his part, apologized to his wife, to his children, and, tellingly, to the police department and sheriff's office he had once served for any embarrassment he'd caused them. Under Ohio law, the judge could impose no more than 16 years to life. That's the sentence Diane's killer received. Here's what this case leaves us with, and as always, this is our own observation, not a legal finding. 2 things run right through it. The first is the shifting story. She left me. She went out of state. She joined a cult. When someone drops out of sight and the explanation for it keeps changing depending on the listener, that inconsistency is not a small thing to smooth over. In the cases we study, the shifting account is very often the loudest signal there is. And the second is harder because it's about trust itself. Gary Stroud's cover held as long as it did because of who he was, a former officer, a man whose word carried the weight of his old profession. And that's the uncomfortable lesson: a respected job, police, medicine, clergy, teaching, is a credibility shield, not proof of innocence. The people around such a person tend to give them the benefit of the doubt, sometimes for exactly as long as it takes for the truth to rot in a garage. So here's the practical part, and it's simple. You do not have to be next of kin to file a missing person report. There is no waiting period. If someone you know goes quiet, and the answers about where they've gone keep changing, you can pick up the phone and ask police for a welfare check, no matter who is telling you everything is fine. That's not a rule of law. It's just what this case, painfully, seems built to teach. Diane Stroud. 53 years old, a mother who took pride in her family, and a woman who gave 8 years of her life to serving the small community she loved. She spent her time making her town a little better, and she deserved to grow old inside it, surrounded by the people and the children she gave so much to. She should have had decades more of council meetings and grandchildren and ordinary Tuesdays. We say her name so that Diane is remembered the way her neighbors remembered her, a good member of council, a good person, a good mother, and not for the silence a man tried to bury her in. Case 8. Summer Dawn Cook Inman. She was taken from the alley behind the bank where she worked, on a night she'd spent making plans to take her kids to the park. 2 men forced her into a car. A woman was driving it, and all 3 of them shared her last name. Her name was Summer. She was 25 years old, born and raised in Logan, Ohio, a small town in the Hocking Hills. She'd graduated from Logan High School in 2004. As a girl, she took ballet and jazz. She had a best friend, Jamie, born just 1 day apart from her. The two had grown up together, gone to the same church, sat in the same classes, and gone on to have children the very same ages. By 2011, Summer was a mother of 3, separated from her husband, and rebuilding her life. She'd moved back home with her parents, Mike and Debbie, and she spent her free hours taking her kids to a local park so they could play. She was, by every account of the people who loved her, right in the middle of starting over. That's what makes what happened so devastating. Summer wasn't in danger because of a stranger. She was in danger because she was leaving. She had filed for divorce, and she was seeking custody of her children. The tension over those children had gotten so bad that the custody exchanges couldn't happen at a home anymore. They were being done at the sheriff's office or the police station in Logan. That is a family whose conflict was already documented, already serious enough that law enforcement was the neutral ground. And it was that fight, over the divorce and over the kids, that prosecutors said got Summer killed. On the night of March 22, 2011, Summer was working late, cleaning the Century National Bank in downtown Logan. Witnesses saw 2 men in dark clothing force her into a white car in the alley behind the building. A blonde woman was behind the wheel. Her father reported her missing, and her family named their suspects almost immediately: her estranged husband, William Inman II, and his parents. This was not an impulsive act. It was a family conspiracy. Investigators used vehicle tracking and local security footage to reconstruct the car's route, out of Hocking County, into neighboring Athens County, to the grounds of a church. It was a church the Inman family had a history with. Will's father had helped build it and had played music there on Sundays. Summer was found in an underground tank on that property. The coroner determined she had been strangled. She was found bound with zip ties, a detail that tells you this was planned and brought. The justice that followed reached all 3 of them. William Inman II was convicted in June 2012 of aggravated murder, kidnapping, tampering with evidence, and gross abuse of a corpse. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, plus 14 consecutive years. His father was convicted separately and also received life without parole. His mother pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 15 years to life. At her plea, she wept and apologized to Summer's family. 3 people went to prison for ending one young mother's life. Here's what this case leaves us with, and as always, this is our own observation, not a legal finding. There's a pattern in these cases that we can't say often enough. The most dangerous moment in an abusive or controlling relationship is very often not while it's happening. It's the leaving. The divorce filing. The custody petition. The moment a person reclaims their own life. That's the window when the risk spikes. And Summers' case adds a second, harder layer. The danger didn't come from one person. It came from a family, acting together. When hostility runs through in-laws, and not just a spouse, the threat can be bigger than a single individual. So here's the part worth carrying. Summers' family had already reached the point of exchanging children at a police station, which means the danger was known and it was on the record. But a safety plan that covers the custody handoff and stops there isn't complete. The rest of a person's life is exposed to a predictable late shift, a fixed workplace, a dark alley behind a building. If someone you love is leaving a frightening relationship, the plan has to cover more than the obvious flashpoint. Their work, their route, their schedule, the people who should be told. Employers can be informed. Shifts and parking can be changed. And when the hostility involves a whole family, the plan has to account for more than one person. That's not a rule of law. It's just what this case, so painfully, seems built to teach. Summer Cook Inman. 25 years old, a small-town girl who took dance classes and stayed best friends with the same person her whole life, a mother of 3 who was doing the brave, ordinary work of building a new beginning. She should be taking her children to that park still, watching them grow, growing old herself, surrounded by the people who loved her exactly as she was. We say her name so that Summer is remembered as her best friend remembered her, not as a case, but as a whole person, funny, loved, and taken far too soon from 3 children who needed their mother. Case 9, Kristina Smith. She got away. She ran. She found a friend. She made it somewhere safe for the night. And she still didn't survive, because the harm had already been done before she ever got out the door. Her name was Kristina. She was 39 years old, a woman who worked hard for her living. She tended bar, and she worked at a Dollar General, holding down more than one job the way so many people do. She was, in the words of the prosecutor who fought for her, deeply loved by her children, her family, and her friends. That's the Kristina her people knew. And it's worth saying at the top of this one, because everything that happened to her happened fast, and it would be easy to lose the person inside the timeline. In October of 2025, Kristina and her husband, Rashid Lagway, were at the bar where she worked. And Lagway became angry. Over something small, over nothing really. He saw Kristina interacting with another customer. That was the spark. When they got back to their Akron home, that anger turned physical. Lagway assaulted her. But here is what makes this case sit with you. Kristina did what we are all told to do. She didn't stay. She got out of that house. She fled, made her way to a nearby McDonald's, and reached a friend. The friend took her to the Dollar General where she worked, and from there she went to another friend's home to spend the night, somewhere safe, somewhere away from him. She had, by every measure we usually mean, escaped. And it wasn't enough. The injuries from the assault were internal, and they were serious. Over the course of that day and night, Kristina was quietly bleeding inside. She was found the next morning at her friend's home. She had died from the injuries Lagway inflicted before she ever ran. Investigators moved quickly. After the assault, Lagway had even gone to the Dollar General looking for her, but she had already gone. Warrants were issued, and he was arrested by a fugitive task force. In April 2026, a Summit County jury convicted Rashid Lagway of murder, felonious assault, and domestic violence. The following month, a judge sentenced him to life in prison, eligible for parole only after 15 years. One note for the record, in the interest of accuracy, some early police reports referred to Kristina as Lagway's domestic partner, while the prosecutor's office and the court identified her as his wife. Either way, the law saw exactly what it was: domestic violence that ended a life. Here's what this case leaves us with, and as always, this is our own observation, not a legal finding. This is the hardest lesson in this entire episode, and we want to be careful with it, because it can be misheard. Kristina escaped, and she still died. It would be so easy to take the wrong thing from that. So let us be very clear about what we are not saying. We are not saying leaving doesn't work. Leaving saves lives. It is still the right thing, and the brave thing, and the thing that ends most of these stories differently than this one. What this case shows is something more specific, and it comes from the medical reality of what happened. Serious internal injuries can be invisible. A person can be walking, talking, making plans, seeming okay, and be badly hurt on the inside in a way that turns deadly hours later. So here is the part worth carrying, and it may be the most practical thing we say all episode. After any significant physical assault, especially any blow to the torso, the abdomen, the chest, get seen by a doctor, even if you feel all right, even if you got away, even if you just want to sleep it off at a friend's. Internal bleeding doesn't always announce itself. Kristina got herself to safety. What she couldn't see was that the danger had already come inside with her. If you or someone you love has been hurt, safe is not the same as unharmed. Please, get checked. That's not a rule of law. It's just what this case, heartbreakingly, is trying to teach. Kristina Smith, 39 years old, a woman working 2 jobs to make her way, and someone who was deeply loved by the children and the people she left behind. She did the hard thing. She got out. She should have woken up that next morning to the rest of her life. More shifts, more ordinary days, more time with the people who loved her. We say her name so that Kristina is remembered not for the night she couldn't survive, but for the fact that she was strong enough to run, a woman who fought to get free and deserved to live long enough to be glad she did. Case 10, Noreen Boyle. Before she died, Noreen Boyle did something almost no victim ever gets the chance to do. She left instructions. She told someone exactly what to do if she disappeared, and she chose the one person she knew would remember. Her name was Noreen. In November of 1989, after 22 years of marriage, she filed for divorce. Her husband, John Boyle, was a respected osteopathic physician in Mansfield, Ohio, a successful man with a thriving practice and a comfortable life. Noreen was the mother of 2, an 11-year-old son named Collier and a young adopted daughter. And by that winter, Noreen had come to understand that her husband was a danger to her. She could feel it closing in. So she did the only thing within her power. She sat her son down. She gave him the names and phone numbers of her friends. And she told him, if your father ever says I've left, if he ever tells you I've gone away, you call all of them. You have them contact the police, and you make them investigate how I disappeared. She could not protect herself. So she built a plan out of the only material she had, one child and the truth. Early on the morning of December 31st, 1989, New Year's Eve, Collier was woken by a scream and 2 heavy thuds. The next morning, his father told him his mother had gone away on a trip. And in that moment, an 11-year-old boy remembered exactly what his mother had told him to do. He went to the Mansfield police. He found a detective, Lieutenant David Messmore, and, without his father's knowledge, he kept feeding him what he saw and what he knew. And the detective took the boy seriously. That is the hinge this entire case turns on. A child carried out his mother's instructions, and an adult in authority chose to believe him. What investigators uncovered was chilling in its planning. John Boyle had bought a house 3 hours away in Erie, Pennsylvania, signing the paperwork alongside a pregnant girlfriend who had written her name as Sherry Boyle. Before Noreen ever died, he had asked the realtor what lay beneath the basement floor. He had rented an electric jackhammer. In the days after, he bought carpeting and arranged for shelving to be installed in the basement. On January 25, 1990, police searched that Erie home. Beneath fresh paint and new carpet, they found a section of concrete that didn't match the rest. And there they found Noreen. She had been buried beneath the floor of the house her husband intended to share with another woman. 5 months later, a Richland County jury convicted John Boyle of aggravated murder and abuse of a corpse. For nearly 3 decades, he denied everything, at times even denying that the body was Noreen at all. He was sentenced to 20 years to life. He was denied parole in 2010, in 2020, and one final time in 2025. And in April of 2026, John Boyle died in custody, at 82 years old. His sentence, at last, complete. Here's what this case leaves us with, and it's the note we want to end the whole episode on. This is our own observation, not a legal finding, but it may be the most important thing we say. Noreen Boyle could not save her own life, but she refused to let herself be erased. She named the people who would ask questions. She named the mechanism, go to the police, make them investigate. And she placed that plan with someone who loved her and would remember. It cost nothing. No shelter, no lawyer, no protection order, no money. Just a mother, a son, and a sentence. Don't believe him. So here is what we'd ask you to carry out of this entire episode. If you are ever afraid, if some quiet part of you is bracing for the day someone says you simply left, tell one person. Out loud. In advance. Give them names. Give them the instruction. Tell them, if you're ever told I disappeared, don't believe it and don't let it go. That single conversation is a safety plan, and it is available to everyone, everywhere, right now. And there's one more piece, because Noreen's plan only worked because of everyone else who chose to act. The realtor who thought a signature looked wrong, the neighbors who contradicted a too smooth story, the detective who took an 11-year-old at his word. None of them looked away. Each of them treated a small wrong note as something worth reporting. That is the role every one of us can play, not solving the case, just refusing to ignore the thing that doesn't sit right. That's not the law. It's just what these 10 stories, together, have been trying to teach us all along. As for that 11-year-old boy, he grew up. Collier Boyle became Collier Landry, a filmmaker in Los Angeles. He has spent his adult life telling his mother's story so that she is never forgotten and speaking for the people who can't. Years later, he said something that has stayed with us, that he doesn't feel vengeful toward his father. What he wanted was never revenge. It was his mother, remembered and believed. Noreen Boyle, a mother who, in the last frightened weeks of her life, had the courage and the foresight to make herself impossible to disappear. She could not stay for her son, but she made sure her son could speak for her. She deserved to grow old. She deserved to see the boy she trusted become the man he is. She deserved so much more than the New Year's Eve she was given. We say her name, Noreen, so that the last word belongs not to the man who buried her, but to the woman whose final act of love reached across 36 years and made sure the truth came home. 10 women, 10 names, 10 lives that should still be here. Rosemarie, Jill, Kristan, Rhonda, Sarah, Fatoumata, Diane, Summer, Kristina, Noreen. They lived in different corners of Ohio across more than 30 years. They were nurses and mothers, a council president, a bar worker with 2 jobs, a newcomer who crossed an ocean, a young woman 4 months married. They did not know one another. But their stories, laid side by side, say the same thing, and it's not a thing about the men who killed them. We've given those men enough of the frame. This is about what it took to pull the truth back out of the dark. Because in every single one of these cases, the truth did not surface on its own. Someone made it. A friend who wrote down what a dying woman said and refused to stay quiet. A family who kept calling until someone filed the report. A first responder who noticed a dry towel. A jury that weighed a life with the seriousness it deserved. A judge who spoke for the person who could no longer speak. A detective who took a child at his word. A doorbell camera that kept an honest record when a husband would not. And reporters, local journalists in small newsrooms, in the towns where these women lived, who kept these names in the light long after the cameras that chased the sensational had moved on. So before we go, we want to say thank you. Truly. To the investigators who worked these cases when they were cold and thankless, to the jurors who gave up their days and carried what they saw home with them, to the prosecutors and the judges who held the line, to the local news outlets whose careful reporting is, quite literally, how stories like these survive to be told at all. Every fact in this episode exists because someone, somewhere, did their job with care, and we are grateful to all of them. But our deepest respect is reserved for the families, the parents raising grandchildren who should have been raised by their mothers, the best friends who still go to the park alone, the sons and daughters who grew up under a shadow they never chose and who somehow found the strength to turn grief into purpose. You are the ones who carry this weight every single day, long after an episode ends. We know that no video gives any of it back. We only hope that saying these names, clearly, carefully, and with respect, honors the people you loved and never adds to what you carry. And to you, watching, here is the one thing we'd ask. You now know the pattern. The shifting story. The delayed call. The threat spoken out loud. The friend who suddenly goes quiet. You know what it looks like now? So if that quiet feeling ever tells you something is wrong, about someone you love or someone you barely know, don't talk yourself out of it. Make the call. Ask the question. File the report. You do not have to be certain, and you do not have to be next of kin. Every truth in this episode reached daylight because one ordinary person decided not to look away. The next time, that person could be you. If you or someone you know is living with abuse, please reach out to a domestic violence helpline in your country. There are people ready to help right now, and reaching out is not weakness. It's the bravest first step there is. Thank you for watching and for caring enough to sit with stories that aren't easy. If this mattered to you, subscribe and stay with us. We tell these stories, state by state, so that the people at the center of them are remembered for their lives, and not only for how those lives were taken. Until next time, look out for each other. Say something. And take care.